88.1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome to What to Watch Weekends. My name is Nathan, and for this morning's show, we are going to be talking about 3 movies by Francis Ford Coppola. First of all, I want to say happy morning or good morning, whichever word phrase you like to use. Good morning to you all. It's a beautiful day here in Ellensburg, although it's still very cold, but it is lovely 9 a.m. And our movies today will be The Godfather from 1972, Apocalypse Now from 1979, I believe. Let me make sure by checking my timeline of events here. Yes, 1979. That is correct. And we will be closing out with The Conversation from 1974. Thank you all for tuning in. We're going to open up with Undercover Martin by Two Door Cinema Club before we get started, so stick around. That was Undercover Martin by Two Door Cinema Club. So, welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. My name is Nathan, and we are going to jump into our first movie of the morning, that being The Godfather from 1972. I reviewed all 3 of these movies on What to Watch Wednesdays this past Wednesday, going from 8 to 9 p.m., and we're doing What to Watch Weekends today, on Saturdays at 9 a.m. So, I might as well just jump right into it. For those of you who are not familiar with The Godfather somehow, The Godfather follows the story of the Corleones, a New York mafia family who's led by the sort of patriarch of the family. I can't remember if it's the patriarch is the term for the father or it's like a monarch thing for the father, and the patriarch is the like mother or the grandmother who leads the family. Either way, it's led by the father, Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando, and they basically have to deal with a whole mess once their youngest son, Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, comes back from serving in the military. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with The Godfather, that's probably a very new introduction for you. For those of you who are familiar with The Godfather, which is there's a very high chance that the vast majority of you are familiar with what The Godfather is and what it's about. I personally didn't see it until like a couple years ago, mostly because of the fact that it's a rated R movie, and I just wasn't really allowed to watch movies like that until much later in my life. But well, comparatively, when you're not super old, much later in your life sounds like a weird term to use. But either way, I will say right now that from the way I had only seen it parodied or things that had kind of been referencing The Godfather, I was expecting Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando, to have a larger role than he had in reality. Let me explain that. For those of you who aren't familiar, one of the more kind of significant scenes in The Godfather is a scene where Vito is gunned down in the streets. It's very famous. It's essentially after he goes to this meetup between other rival families and doesn't agree to their terms. They basically order a hit out on him, and it's just like, I didn't expect that to crop up. I thought he would play a much larger role in the overall story, whereas what actually ends up happening is he gets gunned down, he ends up going to the hospital, and then kind of hangs around there while Michael ends up going through his transformation where he eventually becomes head of the family and replaces Vito. It's not necessarily bad at all. It's just slightly unexpected from the way he's painted in a lot of the parodies. A lot of people tend to parody his quotes of, "Oh, I'm going to give him an offer he can't refuse," or "You come to me on the day of my daughter's wedding." It's like, I was expecting him to be a lot more major in the first movie. And that the scene where he's gunned down feels like it happens about 40 minutes to an hour in the movie. Now, that doesn't seem like kind of it seems like he's there for longer than he actually feels like. To put that, what I'm trying to say is that in a 3-hour movie, an hour is not necessarily a long stretch of time for you to be actively involved in the story, because by the second hour, that's usually when things have kicked off and they're in full motion, and you definitely know your main character and he's gone through enough kind of development to kind of get halfway through his journey, because epic movies tend to be a lot longer, so they kind of structure their stories out to be a lot longer. It kind of caught me by surprise, is the big point. it's nice to know that no matter how much a movie can be parodied, it can still surprise you. And no matter how much you feel like you've already seen it, you definitely haven't seen it until you've actually sat down and watched the thing through, which feels kind of obvious. But some people think often like they feel differently. And I will kind of acknowledge the fact that I'm kind of playing it up a little bit. I'd be a bad critic if I said that Vito has no impact on the story whatsoever. In reality, he's definitely there to just drive the story forward for the first third of the movie. A lot of it has to do with what Vito has to deal with as the sort of head of the Corleones. He's the godfather. He's the one running the show. And so by the time the first act sort of comes to a close, it feels like he's kind of pushed it to a good point for Michael to take over. Take over the story, that is. Not quite take over the family quite yet. But we've definitely started his story arc by the time Vito is gunned down. And that's good. It means that he's a stakes character. Kind of one that sort of drives the story forward and then sort of serves his purpose and possibly exits or kind of phases out of the story eventually. And that's definitely what happens with Vito. I also will say that thankfully for the first third that he's there, Vito does provide much needed sort of build up in a different aspect, not just in the story. One of the reasons that people tend to parody Vito the most is because of Marlon Brando's performance. It is legendary, and so it's like you don't even need to be a professional actor to really see just how good he is at acting, honestly, especially as Vito. Vito's expressions, the way he moves, the way he talks, all of it feels deliberate and intentional in a way that conveys the character perfectly. Vito's meant to be this like absolutely evil man. He's the head of a mob family. Of course he's going to be evil. He's not inadvertently, but by proxy killed dozens of people at the very least over the course of his life. He's basically ordered hits out on people. He's just done so many horrible acts throughout his life. And the way Marlon Brando portrays that is by making a very slow, deliberately kind of methodically moving old man who tends to only raise his eyebrows when needed. That is such a cool idea for a mob boss. Like, such a cold, calculated, deliberate individual is what you need to really sell the point. Because sometimes with an old mob boss, maybe they might be losing their mind a little bit, or maybe they're not necessarily fully in touch. It's very clear that Vito is completely plugged into what's happening, and the only thing that actually stops him is being gunned down in the street. Like, that's dedication and just an overall like commitment to being such an evil person. If you have to be like shot multiple times in order to stop doing what you're doing, that means you're practically an unstoppable force up until that point. And it works so well. And again, the way he moves, the way he adjusts his expression, it feels like he's moving at his own pace when comparing him to all the other characters in the movie. Anyone who comes to him for help seems to be possibly moving around a little bit more. He just kind of stands there and just kind of adjusts as needed without really kind of moving too fast. Part of it, again, is because of his age, but it's also just like, it feels like he's the one setting the pace, and the people he's helping have to move at that pace if they want him to help them, if that makes sense. I just noticed that like he's the one controlling the conversation, whether they want him to or not. He's very much the one, kind of the one who's like in the background at first and then brings himself to the forefront. He just has to be that way because of the nature of what he does. It works so well. And the big reason that I'm bringing up all of these sort of like little details about Vito, even though he doesn't play a major role after the first third of the movie, is because what makes Michael's transformation into the leader of the family so significant is you start to see over time that Michael like adopts most of those traits from Vito, and that's what makes his performance, specifically Al Pacino, just such a wonderful actor. But also what makes that character's transformation so meaningful. You see him basically become his father over time. You see him sort of methodically move his eyebrows. You see him start to control the pace of the conversation. But with this oddly, like, he's basically taken his father's movements and replicated them and then injected his own little, like, personality into them without straying too far away. It's basically like he's definitely a younger version of Vito. He has this fire to him, this like young recklessness that makes him almost more dangerous than Vito. He's just as brutal, just as dominating, but still the same cold and calculated person. It works on so many levels. And it makes the movie just stand out for that reason alone, but it also like it elevates the movie already, because even without those elements, I think The Godfather would still be considered a very decent movie by the average standards, what with the way the plot progresses and the scenes that make up that progression. Because personally, I like to think of I like to think of movies that are good. I think that my opinion of some of the best movies of all time and movies that I consider my personal favorites tend to be broken up into specific scenes where it's like, okay, this scene right here is why this movie is like a classic or why I like it. Because not all of the scenes are going to be like nonstop amazing all the time. They have to take breaks and they have to kind of build things up. It's when the story is moving forward and these scenes are brought to the forefront where the movie really shines. And it doesn't mean that they like skimp out on the in-between scenes, but you just don't remember them as much as these more significant scenes. So, and that's good. That's how you progress a story. You don't want it to be nonstop action unless you're making a very deliberate, moving, like very short, contained thriller movie. With a long, epic crime movie, you can definitely break it up into scenes where not a lot is happening, but the characters or the story are at least moving forward to make sure that you're not stagnating. And The Godfather excels at this kind of thing. I won't go through all of the scenes because I'm not crazy, but I will at least bring up some significant ones. Namely, first of all, the opening wedding scene, the first 20 minutes or so, are when we're introduced to Michael, Vito, basically the two characters who come to Vito for help that basically kick off the story and cause him to get into those meetings and then lead to him being gunned down and then lead to Michael coming back and sort of getting himself involved in the family business. It's just kind of like, here's our setup. Here's where we're going to go from here. And that scene is just so good at portraying what's going to happen without telling you what's going to happen. It's a masterclass. It works on so many different levels. Some of these scenes are like when a minor character is killed off. For example, Luca Brasi. He's not necessarily a significant character, but he is an important character. Again, he's part of the stakes. When he gets killed off, it kind of kicks off other events later down the line. Because of his death, they basically get involved with the rival family that killed him. And that leads to other members of the family being killed off or people getting into trouble because of it. So it's like they very much included every character in there for a reason, whether they get killed off or not. One of the most other scenes that would fall into this category would be in a cafe. Michael ends up getting fully involved in the family business when he goes and kills Solazzo, who's this like rival crime family leader, and McGlutsky, which is this like dirty cop. The two of them are basically rivals of the Corleone family, and Michael goes there, kills both of them. It's a very famous scene, mostly because of how brutal it is. But it also kind of kicks off Michael's progression into the cold man he'd become. And it works on so many levels that I wish I had infinite time to discuss it, but I don't. And so what I can at least say is this is the scene where things are definitely happening, and a lot of the scenes before that are simply setting it up and leading up to that explosive moment. That's how you tell a story. Unsurprisingly, with a movie this good, you got to take away some story aspects from it. One of those other scenes that really gets to me is the second to last scene of the movie. It's basically after Michael has gone through all of his development, such as moving away to Sicily after killing those two before. He ends up going to Sicily, he tries marrying this girl, and then his car gets blown up by a hitman, and she ends up dead from that. He basically comes back from Sicily, ends up getting involved after Vito dies of a heart attack, and he avenges his brother, Sonny, who is gunned down at a toll booth. There's a lot of things that happen in The Godfather. And again, I wish I had infinite time to discuss it, but if you're familiar with it, you know what I'm talking about, so I won't worry about it too much. What I will say, my favorite scene of this movie has to be the second to last one, where Michael is basically becoming an actual godfather. He is at an altar seeing his, I believe, nephew being christened, and he swears to protect him and renounces sin, all of that kind of thing, because it's a Catholic christening ceremony. And meanwhile, he has ordered hits on all of the other rivals, including his brother-in-law, who was abusing his sister. It's crazy because the movie opens with his sister getting married to this guy, and then near the end we learn that he's abusing her. It's it's an interesting progression, because over time it's just like showing how much this family degrades over time. It's just little tiny subplots to kind of tie this world together and to give motivations later down the line for why Michael does what he does. And to just give him an excuse to kill another person off in this explosive final scene, which excuse is not the right word, but it gives him more targets and allows him to distance himself further from his actions and become colder and more brutal than his father ever was in the movie at this point. It's just good progression. It's just how you tell a story. You have to have an explosive finale, and this movie pulls it off so beautifully. I just remember that second to last scene being I was unable to take my eyes off the screen. And by the end of it, his sister confronts him, asking him if he killed her husband, and he basically says no. He lies straight up, and his girlfriend Kay, who has been kind of a sort of background character throughout the movie, but part of his motivation for staying out of the family business, asks him, "Did you actually kill him?" And Michael says, "No, I didn't." And then it ends with the other members of the family coming up to him and calling him Godfather, while he basically has them close the door on Kay, and he basically shuts her out of his life. Shows the progression of going from having a reason to stay out of the family business to straight up going into the family business and staying out of her life. I should mention as well, I just remembered that they do get married at some point in the movie. So his wife, he still had a reason, but it wasn't strong enough to keep him away. And that's just how it all works, honestly. I know I've been a bit all over the place when talking about The Godfather, but it's such a daunting task because you really need like a long amount of time to go into all the ways that Godfather succeeds. And I spent so long talking about like the way Vito moves his eyebrows. That's how kind of deep this movie can get. It's so difficult to explain everything this movie does right in such a short amount of time. But I can say for certain that it just like you can remember the scenes from this movie after seeing it for 2 years or 10 years or multiple years of your life. This movie will never leave your head. And whether you like it or you don't, you cannot deny the impact that The Godfather has had. It is objectively one of the most remembered movies of all time, and it's often considered one of the best. I personally don't think that there is ever going to be a definitive number one answer to what is the best movie of all time, because in reality it changes so often that you can't nail it down perfectly. But I will admit that The Godfather falls into that category of it deserves to be in the top 10 at the very least, top 5 definitely, top 3 very likely that it belongs there. So for those of you who haven't seen The Godfather, highly recommend watching it. I know I'm all over the place with it, but don't let that distract you from the fact that you would be watching one of the greatest movies of American cinema and of all time. So that was that. We are going to take a quick break and listen to Hand of Doom by Black Sabbath, and then we will be back after that. 88.1 The Burg, your Music Central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. My name is Nathan, and we are going to jump in to the second movie of the morning, that being Apocalypse Now from 1979. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the story of Apocalypse Now, I will tell you right now, it's a crazy one, but it essentially revolves around the, I don't remember what exactly his rank is, but I know he's played by Martin Sheen, the character Willard, who goes up the Nung River, which is a fictional river in Vietnam, to kill Colonel Kurtz, who is played by Marlon Brando. This movie is set during the Vietnam War, specifically in 1970, so it's close to the end, but it's definitely not the end of the war quite yet. They still have some time to go. So essentially, the movie is a hallucinatory trip up the river as Martin Sheen, or Willard, essentially loses a lot more of his humanity the longer he keeps going. Very surreal dream-like state. He's captivated by the world around him and how kind of messed up and dark it gets. Essentially, with all the colors and all the death surrounding him, things just become more and more of a fever dream until the very end, which is a very massive fever dream that Willard never recovers from. So that's fun stuff. I will say right now that when I talk about Apocalypse Now, I am reviewing the original version of Apocalypse Now, the one that was released into theaters in 1979. I am aware that that Apocalypse Now has multiple versions to it. It's one of those things like Blade Runner, which has like there's the original version, and then there's like the extended cut, then there's the director's cut, then there's the final cut, and I'm not even making up most of those. It's just, and that's not unheard of in the film industry. There's always multiple versions of some of the best movies out there. It's always like there's the director's cut, here's the international version, here's the one where they cut out the bad words, and here's the one where they added in a weird music track and stuff like that. It's not unheard of, and I know that Apocalypse Now is one of those movies. And specifically, it has the original version, it has the Redux, which is about 3 hours long and includes a bunch of new scenes, and then there's the final cut, which includes some of those new scenes, but cuts some of them out. I haven't watched the Redux or the final cut to Apocalypse Now. I wanted to get the authentic experience of what theater goers would have watched in 1979. I also didn't want to watch the Redux version because I know it's 3 hours long, and part of that comes from the fact that there is a lot of long and boring scenes in it in place of such a kind of scaled down, cut back story that really moves along at a breakneck pace in order to keep that hallucinatory fever dream going for as long as it possibly can consecutively. And that, to me, feels like the point of Apocalypse Now. It's meant to be this constantly ramping up nightmare. Whereas with the Redux version, there's apparently a notoriously long scene where they sit at a French villa and talk about nothing for at least 10 minutes of the movie. That doesn't really sound like something I'd want to spend my time watching. And I'm sure I'm right, because I've heard some people say that the Redux version is not very good. Some people say that. Some people would probably argue, no, this is the original version of, the original vision of Francis Ford Coppola should always be preserved and should be held above the rest of it. It's just like, I don't want to argue against that because I don't care enough to actually watch it. I don't have an infinite amount of time on my hands, and I'm a college student. Of course, I won't. And it's also just like I don't want to spend 3 hours watching this kind of movie. I feel like keeping it short and simple, which even then it's like about a 2 hours and 15 minutes movie. Man, I was trying to say like 2 and 15 minutes movie, which is like trying to say 2.5 hours, but it turns into 2 and 15 minutes, which is not how you grammatically pronounce things. But regardless of that, regardless of grammar mistakes, the point is that I just don't want to waste that amount of time on the movie like this. I feel like its length that it was originally at was perfectly fine, and if you disagree with that, that is completely fine, but I will not back down from this. Of course, I need to watch the Redux version to really get an idea, but I also just I don't know when I'm gonna have time to do that. So it's just like, okay, who knows? Um, I will say as well that one of the more known things about Apocalypse Now is that it's based off the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, I believe. I'd have to look it up. Hang on a moment. But essentially, the story of Heart of Darkness is it's about this ivory trader who makes his way up a river, basically in the early, kind of in the late 1800s. And yes, it is Joseph Conrad. He essentially makes his way up the river because he hears of another ivory trader by the name of Kurtz, who is apparently being incredibly evil. He kind of discovers the evil of the settlers and how they treat the natives of the Congo River. And basically, Kurtz is the name of the sort of villain in Heart of Darkness, so they kind of took Kurtz from there and put him into Apocalypse Now. Essentially, they just took the entirety of Heart of Darkness and moved it to Vietnam instead of being in the Congo in the 1800s. Again, if I had infinite time in my life, I would be open to reading Heart of Darkness. It sounds like a very messed up book, but one that was obviously inspiring in many ways to things that have kind of impacted us in the current day in terms of movies. And so it might be worth reading at some point. It's kind of like reading the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas after watching the movie. I could see what really inspired such a bizarre masterpiece. I will also say that Apocalypse Now is now one of my favorite movies to talk about, specifically for one very interesting fact that I have about it. It's going to take a bit of setup, and you're not going to understand where I'm going until I get there. So please bear with me as I take you on a bit of a journey. Let me explain, first of all, that this story involves my dad. My dad is a person who does not like violence. He doesn't like them in video games. He doesn't like them in movies or TV shows. He really doesn't like violence. He's not one who's open to seeing a lot of violence, fictional or not. And that partially comes from a religiously conscious side of him who doesn't really want to see people get killed, and that's completely fine. He very much has the philosophy of if you expose yourself to too much violence in the media, you tend to become disillusioned and kind of desensitized to it, which does have some basis to it. It's very much a known fact that if you watch too much of it, you become kind of not, you don't tend to take it in as much. It's founded on a very good fact, but I will admit that in my opinion, sometimes he takes it a little far, such as when it's in a cartoon like Bugs Bunny or something like that, and they play off Daffy Duck getting shot in the face by Elmer Fudd as a joke. Like, I don't think he takes that too seriously, but he's taken the violence in a Lego video game seriously before, to my memory. It's kind of a, okay, is this a little too far? It could possibly be just a little too far. And I don't want to say that he's wrong, but again, there's a certain point where it's just like, okay, Don't take it too seriously. I will also say my dad is very much against the idea of war. He's against the use of weapons. Again, he's very appalled to violence, but it gets specific in those instances. He doesn't like the fact that we go to war. He thinks war is pointless. He also thinks that guns are some of the most evil inventions since we made a shotgun to straight up kill people with, which again, it's got some basis to it. Don't get me wrong. It can get a little extreme some point. It's just kind of like he can go on for hours about it. And that's never fun for any topic that people aren't interested in. It's like you got to be in the right mental state to really take in a long rant about those kinds of things. And sometimes you're not in the right mood for that. And that goes for anybody, not even my own dad. That goes for any person at all. And I will admit that sometimes I just haven't been in the right mood to hear that kind of thing. What I will tell you is, despite all of those things I have just mentioned about my own father, despite him being anti-war, being anti-weapons, and being anti-violence, especially being against R-rated movies, he loves Apocalypse Now, which is insane to me, or at least it was until I took a step back and thought about it for a second. See, my dad, again, doesn't like violence in movies. He doesn't like seeing people get killed fictionally for no reason at all. And I could see him possibly kind of growing accustomed to seeing it in a movie if it has a point to it. Again, if he's religiously conscious, he's read the Bible before, and the Bible does tend to have some violent scenes, but it's all in the interest of getting its point across, which you can't deny. The Bible has many points to get across, and it does tend to use the violence to get those points across. And so I can't put it past him to really consider that kind of thing. I will also admit that the use of weapons and the warfare in Apocalypse Now more so kind of shows the overall message of being against Vietnam. And I know for a fact that when he was younger, he tended to research Vietnam. He was like kind of obsessed with the Vietnam War for a good portion of his life. And so I guess the more I think about it, the more I go, okay, it at least makes sense. It's not out of the blue. I will admit, the way I found out about it was out of the blue because we talked about it while watching the movie Tommy Boy, which is a very far away movie from what Apocalypse Now is. It's a goofy comedy starring David Spade and Chris Farley, where they try to save Chris Farley's dead dad's car empire or something like that. It's goofy. And I don't remember how we got on the topic of Apocalypse Now when watching that movie, but it's funny that it happened. And again, I do get why he likes the movie. It's an anti-Vietnam War movie that uses its violence to show an incredibly horrifying nightmare of what war truly is and how it dehumanizes people. I get why he'd like a movie that has the same kind of chemical mixture that is Apocalypse Now. On the other hand, I feel like Apocalypse Now is just in that sort of weird in-between space where he would possibly write it off today as just being another violent war movie and not really give it a second glance. I feel like it makes more sense that he watched it when he was younger, because then he was more open to that kind of thing, especially stuff regarding the Vietnam War. It's just like, it really surprised me because the man he is today would not be interested in watching a movie like Apocalypse Now, regardless of the fact that it makes an anti-war point. And so that to me is just such a fun and interesting thing to sort of pick apart, because I'm sure there's a lot of reasons why he watched it when he was younger, and most of those reasons have probably he's left those reasons behind as he's grown older, and it's just a fun thing to think about. Like, I'll put it this way. He was like, oh man, I really liked Apocalypse Now, but then he went on to say, I don't know if I'd watch it today, which is fine. But again, it's just such a fun fact to me. Another thing he doesn't like the Redux cut, the 3 hour version. That's part of the reason I don't like it and I don't want to watch it, is because he was completely bored watching it. Again, he can get bored at movies pretty easily, but like if he's bored and he was just like, this is garbage, I was like, okay, I don't have any real incentive to watch the Redux cut. I have no interest in it. Might as well use that as a good excuse as well, right? I am allowed to use excuses with this. So that's just an entire like saga in and of itself, is just the connection there of my own father loving the movie Apocalypse Now when it seems like he wouldn't like it. I feel like that's the best way to sell this movie, that some people who may not even like it, may not be the audience for it, would definitely like it. And mostly in the fact of him being the primary audience when he saw it, still goes to show that many years later, he still has it ingrained into his memory and can still talk about it like it's a movie that he actually legitimately enjoyed experiencing. So that's really something. That's a really strong sell, in my opinion. I will also highlight that I personally do love the movie Apocalypse Now. I would highly recommend watching it. But I also wanted to take a quick moment to talk about a video game that's similar to Apocalypse Now. I know I get a little off track here and there, but I do want to emphasize that, again, like with my own father, this is just more of a personal anecdote, and I really want to emphasize that this is in the interest of just telling the story. One thing about Apocalypse Now, like I said, it's based off the book Heart of Darkness. There's a video game that's also based off of Heart of Darkness and kind of takes inspiration from Apocalypse Now. It's a game called Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops is essentially about these three soldiers who get dropped into a practically post-apocalyptic Dubai that's been overrun by sandstorms. And they essentially have to locate this colonel by the name of, let's see here, Colonel Conrad. They basically have to locate this guy named Conrad, Joseph Conrad being the guy who wrote Heart of Darkness. Over time, they essentially get deeply embroiled into the messed up, like, depravity of the people living in Dubai. They essentially have to commit some rather heinous acts throughout it, and it becomes this incredibly hallucinatory nightmare where the main character, Walker, loses all sense of his humanity and is caught in this constant nightmare set across a backdrop of a military setting. Let me ask you, does that sound vaguely familiar to something that we've been talking about? That's right. It is very similar to Apocalypse Now. It's basically the closest thing you're going to get to an Apocalypse Now video game. And that is something worth mentioning. I think the things they kind of change are, again, the settings. Again, they change it from the Ivory Trader to be set in the current day Dubai that's been overrun by sandstorms rather than being in Vietnam. They change up with having like multiple characters that we kind of follow. It's a lot more contained in the squad. And it's a lot more about like the experiences of the main character Walker and seeing things from his perspective. But that gives them the opportunity to still keep in a lot of the things that Apocalypse Now did, such as the hallucinations, the constant like weirdness of the situation, the way things progress and get darker and darker, the way that the violence is portrayed, especially since it's a video game with weapons and shooting, it tends to get pretty gruesome. And they basically force you to contemplate the evil in every single human being, with the added benefit of you being the person playing the video game and playing as the main character who has to go through all of that contemplation. And the biggest way I can recommend Spec Ops is by saying that it's a very relaxing game that I would highly recommend playing on a very sunny Sunday afternoon where you have nothing going on and just want to relax and unwind after a stressful week. It will honestly really relax you. And I'm being incredibly sarcastic. No, it's a horrifying nightmare, but it also does its job so well that I am confident in calling it Apocalypse Now, the video game. High recommendation. If you can play it, if you have any interest in it, I would recommend Spec Ops: The Line. which again, related to Apocalypse Now. It's Apocalypse Now, but a video game. So do you want to hallucinate as a video game character? Congratulations. We are going to take a break, but one of the songs that we're going to play after some kind of interjections will be The End by The Doors, which is a very famous song, and it plays over the beginning of Apocalypse Now. So stick around for that. 88.1 The Burg, your Music Central. My name is Nathan. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. And for our last movie of the morning, before we close out the show, I'd like to talk about The Conversation from 1974, also directed by Francis Ford Coppola, the man who directed both The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. So there has been a theme so far, and I just haven't brought it up. Oopsies. The Conversation was the last movie I reviewed on Wednesday's show, and it shall be the last one I review on this show today. So let's just jump into it. This movie follows a man by the name of Harry Call, which is interesting because you'd think it'd be spelled like call, like you're calling someone on a phone, C-A-L-L, but it's actually spelled C-A-U-L, so it's an interesting name. And I'll get to why the phone bit would be significant in just a minute. But essentially, Harry Call, who is a independent surveillance contractor, overhears a conversation, or he rather is surveilling a conversation between a man and a woman, and he ends up hearing some weird sort of offhanded comments that lead him on a path of figuring out what exactly they said, what it meant, and why the person that hired him wants this conversation specifically to be recorded and passed on to them. Because he works independently, he's hired by a big company who wants this information for their own reasons, and he wants to figure out what that reason is. So it's a mystery movie, and a very good one at that. One of the big standout features of this movie to me is that it features Harrison Ford as a villain. He's basically the underling of the corporation and kind of the main obstacle that Harry has to face during the first two acts of the movie. He's essentially always in the background following him around after he refuses to give up the information. He holds on to the recordings that he got from the conversation, and Harrison Ford essentially has to track him down and is kind of this menacing figure the entire time. And it's ridiculous because usually Harrison Ford is seen as kind of the good guy in a lot of stories. He's not really like a villain per se ever all that much. And I think that's significant to point out. He's not on the screen for very long, but you know it's Harrison Ford and you recognize, wow, that's Han Solo basically being a jerk. That's really interesting. That's an interesting take for him. And I feel like I may need to watch a lot more Harrison Ford movies. But from the fact that he played characters such as Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and like Jack Ryan in a couple movies, I definitely think it's within the realm of realistic expectations to say that he's not necessarily an actor known for playing a villain ever. Even in something like The Prisoner, where he may have been seen as a character who was a bit morally questionable, it was revealed later on that he was definitely not the bad guy in that movie. And that's just an interesting point to highlight. He's never been a villain, and in The Conversation he is. So that, right off the bat, is a strong recommendation. If you want to see Harrison Ford be typecast out of his normal roles, there you go. I will also say that Harry Call is played by Gene Hackman. I haven't seen many other things with Gene Hackman in it, but after watching The Conversation, I'm more than inclined to watch many things that have Gene Hackman in it. I think he's a wonderful actor. Harry Call proves that point so much. He's just... His character is intended to reveal many things and conceal the truth. And that, to me, having such a character who's very... So Harry is a very paranoid character. He's always looking over his shoulder. He doesn't want people knowing information about him. Even his birthday is off limits, and he doesn't like people asking him questions. That is a very good personality to kind of adopt in order to play a character who spends his livelihood, essentially, surveilling people, recording information that they don't want other people knowing about. Essentially, tracking people and kind of like taking down their information, recording them without their knowing. He's very conscious of that happening to him, but he's more than willing to do it to other people. That's just such an interesting dynamic that they play around with a lot over the course of this movie. And it wouldn't have worked as well if it wasn't played by Gene Hackman. I'll say that much. He fits that role so well. It works in so many ways that you would both expect and not expect. And I would go into more detail, but I also don't want to give away the plot too much of the conversation. Trust me, like I said, there is an underlying mystery of what exactly they said during that conversation, and he goes on this journey to kind of figure out what it means and figure out why the people that hired him want that information. I could tell you exactly what happens and why there's such an interesting and well thought out twist to the story and what it all really means, but I don't want to. I want to just recommend you watch the movie for yourself before I have a chance to really spoil it for you, because the movie's just central mystery is so compelling that I don't even, like, I have no qualms about spoiling The Godfather, because everybody's heard of The Godfather. I don't have a problem with spoiling Apocalypse Now, because this is What to Watch Weekends, and it's completely fine to spoil things. The conversation is a bit different, because I feel like a lot of the charm and the way you kind of get into the movie is figuring out exactly what's going on. I remember when watching this movie, I basically paused it at one moment and said out loud, okay, Francis Ford Coppola, how about you show me what you got? And then I let it play out, and I went at the end, wow, that's what you got. Okay. Now, normally, here's the funny thing about this weird standard is that usually I would not have qualms about spoiling a mystery movie, except I might, because I don't want to give away all of the details for a movie unless it kind of calls for it. It's more so about unpacking the way the movie is structured and the way it looks and the way it sounds and a lot of the other sort of technical aspects before diving too deep into the story, unless it's very, very good. And I tend to just give kind of the overall summarization of the story and then point out if the ending twist is good or not. I will say right now, the ending twist to the conversation is very good, but I will not break down what actually happens. You're going to have to watch it for yourself if you want to know. So instead, I will break down one of the technical aspects that I really appreciate after watching all three of these movies, and that is the fact that Francis Ford Coppola movies tend to have a very good cinematographer. A lot of the ways that the camera moves in Apocalypse Now is just so incredibly, like, it sells the idea of this hallucinatory fever dream so well, and the way it's edited also works in tandem with the way that camera moves, specifically in the opening scene where you see this ceiling fan kind of faded in with this jungle being destroyed and Martin Sheen's face lying upside down. Like, that's a way of how you blend those things together. Surprisingly for the conversation, for a movie that's simply kind of a standard sort of mystery thriller movie, you wouldn't expect them to kind of go all out on the cinematography, and yet they do. The opening shot of the conversation is this very slow sort of bird's eye view of a massive square where they're basically going to be surveilling the couple, this man and woman. And this camera starts up very high, and then it moves down to follow different characters, such as a mime on the street randomly, and eventually settling on Harry Call. And it follows him for a good portion of that sort of, after it's dropped down, it follows him for a little while before cutting away to him getting in the car and starting his surveillance more so. It works on so many levels because it's a very long movement, but it gives them time to incorporate the credits in a way that's still visually interesting, and then it sets up the main character. And it kind of shows us exactly who's going to be followed throughout the course of the story. Of course, it spends a little bit of time on the mime, but I feel like it was, like a lot of mimes, they tend to show you things, they tend to pretend, they pretend that there are things there that aren't actually there. And I feel like that's a very interesting visual metaphor to kind of illustrate that in the conversation, there are things that are definitely not there, and you're kind of looking for them, but you can't necessarily touch them or find them or grab them or reach them at all. that actually sells the movie perfectly because this movie is a mystery. The mystery is about the mystery isn't about what's there. The mystery is about what isn't there and how do we find what isn't there. And how do we take what isn't there and run with it until we can't anymore. If you've seen The Conversation before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen The Conversation before, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you go and watch it, and I'd highly recommend doing so. Um, I just I will say that the midpoint of The Conversation isn't necessarily the most like it doesn't drive the story forward as much as you'd think it would, but it doesn't take a break from kind of building up things. Like I said with The Godfather, this kind of tangent I went off on. When crafting a story, it's completely fine to kind of slow down if you're not going to be moving at such a fast pace. And with The Conversation, it's not moving at the fastest pace possible. A lot of the scenes are dedicated to building up Harry Call and the way he functions, the way he thinks, what he's doing with his life, and how he really sees the world around him. And the midpoint stretch is a little weird in the fact that it kind of puts the story on hold just to focus on Harry. It's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. You just kind of have to be prepared for it, because I was a bit unprepared, and I would have gotten bored if they didn't have that focus on Harry Call, if they didn't have a way to build up his character and kind of establish exactly what's going on with his mind. I don't think it would have been an interesting scene. But it's why he deserves a shout out, and why Gene Hackman is such a good actor, in my opinion, is because those scenes specifically demonstrate exactly what's going through his head at any given moment for the rest of the movie. And for that reason, the midpoint stretch is an essential part of any storytelling aspect. Like that sort of focus on the character that you're going to be following for the rest of the movie is welcome in a story, because it allows you to connect with him and allows you to understand what's going on. Oddly enough, I feel like my only problem is that I relate to Harry a little too much by the time the movie ends, which is not a good thing, because even though his over-paranoid self is a very good sort of character to put into a mystery thriller about surveillance, it's not necessarily something you should strive to be. If you want to be a socially awkward and incredibly paranoid person who hides the truth from everyone around you, that's not necessarily a good thing, is it? And I personally just didn't like that aspect, which is that if I only partially related to that, that's not necessarily a good thing, and I should strive to not do that kind of thing. But so rolls the dice, as they don't say. I don't know what saying I was trying to come up with there, but it's really my only qualm with a movie that is so well paced, so well structured, and so well characterized that I don't even feel compelled to spoil the movie for you. So it's got multiple things going for it that any nitpicks are just that, nitpicks. And that really closes all I have to say about Francis Ford Coppola. It kind of wraps it up nicely. Most of the things that you can criticize him for are either kind of partially nitpicks or things that aren't really significant in the overall grand scheme of things. He's very much an iconic director for a reason. I think he's one of the best ones, and I've only seen a couple of his movies, but I've liked each one of them. They each have something to offer, and you walk away feeling like you actually got something out of the experience. And so the big takeaway is I'd highly recommend watching all three of these movies and many more by Francis Ford Coppola. Specifically, I am personally excited to watch Megalopolis, a 2024 movie that will hopefully come out this year, which is this crazy, almost Baroque-looking sci-fi movie starring the likes of Adam Driver, Forrest Whitaker, and just an entirely massive all-star cast, as well as like Nathalie Emmanuel. There's so many names attached to that movie that I can't possibly remember them all, but I know those three: Adam Driver, Nathalie Emmanuel, and Forrest Whitaker. It looks like such an interesting movie. I haven't seen a trailer for it, but I really want to see a trailer for it, and I really hope it gets released this year. It's a movie that Francis Ford Coppola has been planning to make since Apocalypse Now, and he's spent almost, I believe, $200 million of his own money just to make the movie. It was either 200 million or it was 20 million. I think it was closer to 20 million, which is still a lot, but it's not as much as 200. Either way, it's a lot of money that came from himself in order to fund this project that he really believes in. And if he believes in it that much, I want to see where it goes. I want to see how he's planned out this movie, because it's going to be something else. You can only expect quality from one of the most iconic directors of all time. So with that, I'd like to close out What to Watch Weekends. Thank you all for listening in. Follow What to Watch Wednesdays at What to Watch Wednesdays on Instagram. I will be back on What to Watch Wednesdays this upcoming Wednesday. I've said the word Wednesday multiple times now. It will be this upcoming Wednesday from 8 to 9 p.m. here on 88.1 The Burg. So I will see you all next time.